Damaged Defenders by Scherza. Chapter 93. Loki and Tony Alfheim, Part 1. The first thing Loki did the next morning, before everyone else save Thor was even fully awake, was put a spell on everyone, including Thor, to shield them from malicious magic. King Solar would see it as beneath him to bespell Thor or the humans, but Loki absolutely did not trust any other elves to feel the same way. Not that they would use a spell that would actively damage them, but something that would irritate, annoy, or frighten? Definitely. That such a thing would trouble Thor and the humans would only be half the fun for those of such a mind to do that. The other half of the fun would be in testing Loki. Quite a number of elves found it exceedingly insulting and vexing that Loki was so magically powerful as to be a match for or even exceed their own abilities. Loki normally enjoyed such a competition, but he was not in a mood to tolerate elves playing games with... What in the name of the Norns did he even call them? His team is... friends? The one seemed too impersonal. The other, well, Loki was not sure he'd ever actually had friends to know to label someone as such, though he was beginning to suspect that the Avengers did indeed fulfill the requirements, as the spell would visibly flare if someone tried to put a spell on Thor or the humans. Loki added a twist to the spell on humans. Mages left, for lack of a better description, fingerprints on whatever magic they wielded. Visually, this manifested as a mage's spellwork being a particular color or colors, something even those with no ability in magic could detect. Loki's spells, for instance, had a green and gold color scheme. There were other components that were only detectable to other sufficiently trained mages. Loki, at a very young age, had learned how to mask his magical fingerprint so as to muddy the waters as to the source of a magical prank. The twist he had applied this time, however, went one further than merely masking the source of a spell. It would make it look as if the magical protection he had placed had been generated by the humans of the group. It was too bad that everyone knew Thor had little to no magic of his own, or he'd have done the same for Thor. Loki had chosen a white-blue for Tony. Despite the man's fondness for red and gold, the color of the arc reactor had seemed more appropriate. Steven got the red and gold, while Soldier got gold as a nod to his connection to Steven, and silver white as a nod to his unwilling role as the soldier. They all three got suitable magical fingerprints. None of the humans noticed Loki applying the spell, not even Soldier, which pleased him greatly. Thor, being far more familiar with the feel of Loki's magic, shot him a raised eyebrow look, but surprisingly said nothing. Thor's new sense of discretion and willingness to trust him, while delightful, was going to take a while for Loki to get used to. The protective spell aside, there was literally nothing Loki could do for the trio of humans. They were going to have to deal with Solar and the other elves entirely on their own merits. Loki was more than a little curious how that was going to go. He knew Tony had a general plan in mind, but what exactly that was, and how he intended to play it out, Loki didn't have the foggiest notion. Just to make things more interesting, after he'd woken up sufficiently, Tony dragged, metaphorically, Steven aside, and the two of them disappeared behind closed doors for a good 15 minutes. Loki was fairly sure that had been Tony letting Steve in on his plan. He'd have to at least let Steven in on some small part of it. That much Loki knew from experience after including Thor in some of his schemes when they'd been little. Given their similar difficulties with lying convincingly, Loki was relatively sure that Tony had told Steven only enough to allow him to act and react in a way beneficial to Tony's plans. The transformation as they rode towards the Bifrost landing area was startling. Loki had seen Tony in a number of moods at the tower, and during the tour he'd been by turns as excited as a child, and very open, personable, and relatively easygoing in a way that Loki suspected was foreign to Tony's nature, though not quite so foreign as a lot of people doubtlessly believed. Now, though, that was changing. The angle of his shoulders, his posture, the angle he was holding his head at, all were shifting out of the relaxed stances he'd had the last few days and into something Loki was torn between calling arrogant and antagonistic. In no likelihood, both! Tony's eyes had also gone cold, hard, and calculating, and the rest of his expression was haughty. Just from the body language and facial expression alone, Loki had a feeling he knew what Tony's plan was beyond the general out-arrogant them he had mentioned when dealing with the elves had come up. Loki had the strong suspicion that Solar was about to meet his match. He was going to enjoy this. The elves were more open about guarding their landing zone than anyone save Asgard, where all travelers were vetted and met by Heimdall. There were 10 elves well back from the area, ready to start throwing spells if someone unwanted came through at all times. Loki knew that an entire regiment stood ready at all times to respond to an unfriendly visitor. Tony rode right up to the closest one, and since being on the horse put them about eye to eye, patted the elf on the cheek, then pinched it. "Beg a little minion and tell Sally's got visitors," Tony said. Loki had to exert real effort not to choke on air. Great Nords. The outer gall! This was going to be even more entertaining than Loki had thought. The elves looked like they didn't quite know what the heck to do, completely thrown by Tony's rather spectacular entrance. The one Tony had accosted looked particularly torn between punching Tony in the face and turning him into something exceedingly unfortunate. "Well, chop chop, I'm a very important man and I have better things to do than sit here trying to get people to do their jobs," Tony said in the most snotty tone Loki had ever heard out of him. To Loki's right, Steven was turning a rather remarkable shade of red, though whether that was from an effort not to laugh or yell, Loki was uncertain. Thor was even less successful at hiding his own reaction, looking nearly as stunned as the elves, but also extremely amused. It took a few moments, but the accosted elf headed off, which was not the way it went. The elves used magic to communicate long distance. Before Loki could think of a way to clue Tony in, Tony let out an extremely rude noise. "I thought you said these guys had magic, Loki," Tony asked, actually turning his horse so he could face Loki. "I mean, I've seen what you could do, so that guy either has less magic than Thor over there, or he thinks I'm stupid." Oh, Loki was deeply grateful he thought to protect Tony because the looks he was getting were promising messy, lingering deaths. "Well, he is serving as a messenger boy to alert their army if someone nasty comes through. So you might have a point about his magical abilities." Never let it be said that Loki was shy about adding fuel to the fire. "But I wouldn't put it past them to think you simple, either." Tony huffed theatrically. "Well, if they're going to be that way." At which point he dismounted, threw the suitcase armor he'd kept with him even after visiting Svartalfheim to the ground, and let it wrap around him. "I guess I'll just cut out the middleman. Ciao." And then he blasted off. There was a trick to dealing with arrogant assholes. Tony had learned that at a young age. You either found a way to work around them, like Pepper had done for a year or so before Tony had stopped fighting her so hard, or you proved you were the bigger arrogant asshole and made them dance to your tune. Since they didn't have the time to work around Solar, and Tony definitely didn't have the personality for it, Tony opted for what he knew best and what had worked with essentially the entire US government and military complex. Be the bigger arrogant asshole. If he'd read things right, Loki would do something to make sure no one imperiated them or the like. Hey, he used the Harry Potter spells until and unless it was proven to him they weren't possible. So that end of things wasn't a problem. His biggest problem was actually going to be Steve, who would probably throw a fit about Tony acting like an asshole. That Tony could handle, but not if Captain Righteous did it in front of the elves. So the first thing he did once his brain was in gear was pull Steve aside. "Look, Cap, I know we've been working together to deal with these people so far, but with the elves, I'm going to kind of need you to follow my lead." Steve eyed him for a moment. "You have a plan in mind to deal with them and the arrogant thing?" Tony nodded. "Yep. I don't really think your earnest, honest, and humble thing will do the trick." Which had earned him a flat, scowly look from Steve, which just made Tony grin. which got him an exasperated eye roll. And really, it was entirely too tempting to twit Steve and get more reactions along that vein. So Tony liked having an excuse to let his inner asshole rip. People could deal. The brief tussle with the guards at the landing zone had been enough to tell Tony that if anything, Loki had understated the arrogance thing. The flight was informative. Alfheim was really kind of ridiculously pretty. Very forested compared to the others so far. He spotted a few small villages, or more likely army outposts, given how close they were to the Bifrost landing zone as he flew. Finding the capital city was ridiculously easy. It was situated on the edge of a pretty tall cliff, and was all tall spires and weird angles that made his inner architect shriek like an insane cat about structural supports, load-bearing weights, and other fun things. He had to dodge a few spells, pretty sparkly streaks of color that shot up towards him. Aw, aren't you people adorable? Pretty sparkly princesses, he said, making sure the exterior speakers were on and broadcasting. Let me show you how it's done. And he opened up with every flare and chaff around the suitcase suit had, which was a lot. He'd loaded up on them especially for this before they'd left Earth. None of it would do any damage, whatever, but it would make for a heck of a bright show, which was half the point. That it would at least superficially bear a resemblance to spellcasting was the other half of the point. It wouldn't fool them for long, but it would put them on the back foot long enough for Tony to get some serious momentum going. While they were spazzing about that, he landed. Unsurprisingly, by the time the suit had folded away, he had an audience. Including Lucius Malfoy. No, seriously, it really was, or as close as may know of our mind. White blonde hair, pale blue eyes, aristocratic features, nose in the air, haughty expression, and fancy clothes. God help it, the guy even had a pimp cane, though sadly it didn't have a snake head on it, and let's not forget the fancy filigree jewel-encrusted crown on the guy's head. So, this was Salar. Tony was very hard put to not laugh his butt off at the guy. So, I'm guessing that minion I sent to let you know I was here didn't get here ahead of me. Good help is so hard to find, am I right? Well, I'm sure you'll get them whipped in shape eventually, though I kind of liked that sparkly greeting I got. Very pretty. Salar looked like he was about ready to chew metal and spew out bullets. Tony just forged ahead, literally, as well as metaphorically, and slapped the guy on the arm. Come on, Sal, we got a lot to talk about. Bad guys to kill, realms to save, you know, it is busy, always busy. So, let's get some eats, some booze, and get this party started. What do you say? And then, with a sort of timing that was frankly suspicious as hell, Loki and the others popped in, and a few of the dark elf guards with them as escort. Ah, excellent, the rest of my retinue has arrived, Tony said, then waved it towards them negligently. You know Thor and Loki already, the other two hardly matter, secretary and security, you know how it is, the missus insisted. I keep telling her I could kick plenty of ass all on my lonesome, but she worries. It's best to let her have her way. She nags something awful, otherwise you get into one little incident that overthrows a couple of governments and you never hear the end of it.